you. Well, good evening, everyone. It's 6:30. I would like to welcome you to the regular meeting for the public session of June 16th, 2021. And I'm hereby calling the meeting to order. And I would ask Derek if you would play our national anthem, please. Acting Director, Mr. Richard, I would ask you to take roll call, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to take the roll call for this regular meeting of the Upper Canada District School Board dated June 16, 2021. Trustee Barry.
Trustee Barry's having some difficulty getting logged in. I asked him to start over again, so he will. There he is.
And Mr. Chair, I see him on the video, so we'll put him as present. Trustee Cram.
Present.
Trustee Danaher.
Present.
Trustee Jacobs.
Present.
Vice Chair McPherson.
Present.
Chair McAllister.
Present.
Trustee McCray.
Present.
Trustee McDonald.
Present.
Trustee Petitjean.
Present.
Trustee Schooler.
Present.
Trustee Swan.
Present.
Student Trustee Evans. Student Trustee Hughes.
Present.
Mr. Chair, we have quorum this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Richard. Moving to 501, I have a motion by Trustee Jacobs, seconded by Trustee McCray, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve consent agenda items 502 to 503, June 16, 2021, as submitted. Please cast your ballots, and I am in favor.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. We will move to 601. Are there any conflict of interest declarations?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to declare conflict on item 1205, please.
Thank you. It will be so noted. Hearing no further conflict of interest declarations, we will move to Article 801, which is the comments from the Acting Secretary of the Board.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to bring director's comments to this June 16th board meeting. In recognition of National Indigenous History Month and National Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21st, 2021, The Upper Canada District School Board has prepared resources and activities for grade K to 12 classes leading up to National Indigenous Day on June 21st. Schools are committed to sharing the rich cultures and traditions and taking advantage of resources to bring Indigenous perspectives into our classrooms. We are incredibly proud to showcase our students' Akwesasne awareness videos. This year, the students at Cornwall Collegiate VS and Akwesasne Foundations have partnered with Ketanese Research and Management and Akwesasne Television to create 2 student-driven videos that will provide an understanding of contemporary life in Akwesasne and our students' thoughts about protecting Mother Earth from a Haudenosaunee perspective. June 21st, the summer solstice and the day of the year with the longest light, is a good time to celebrate Indigenous peoples and cultures. Chair, on June 9, 2021, the Ministry of Education released its anticipated de-streamed grade 9 math course. The new grade 9 mathematics course replaces the grade 9 applied and academic mathematics courses last updated in 2005, as well as the grade 9 mathematics transfer course applied to academic. This new course will be implemented in classrooms across the province starting in September 2021. This new math course builds on the 2020 elementary math curriculum to better support successful student transitions from elementary to secondary school. The new course is designed to be inclusive of all students by offering opportunities for them to build a solid foundation in mathematics, to broaden their knowledge and skills, and to develop a positive mathematical identity. This approach also keeps students' option open to support informed decision about future mathematics courses. Along with the curriculum, the ministry has released initial resources for educators and parents, guardians, including curriculum overview videos, a key changes document, and parent guardian guide. Additional resources and implementation supports will be added to the curriculum and resources website in the coming months. 2 Upper Canada District School Board students walked away with silver medals in the annual Skills Ontario competition this year. Grade 9 Carleton Place High School student Connell McQuay and grade 12 Perth and District Collegiate Institute Matthew Piaskowski both earned 2nd place in the province-wide competition that was hosted remotely for the first time in the competition's history. The skills competition offers a unique opportunity for students to demonstrate they are the best of the best in their field. Winners are awarded with medals and some with monetary awards, and given the chance to compete at the Skills Canada national competition. For the remote virtual Skills Ontario competition, students competed from their own classrooms or at home as opposed to meeting in one location with other competitors. The aim for each contest was to be as close as possible to in-person competitions in terms of contest difficulty and comprehensiveness. Connell McQuay competed in the computerized numerical control woodworking competition. Students had to create a unique sign recognizing that skilled trades are in high demand. Connell had all his toolpaths required to cut the project completed for the CNC woodworking competition over a week before the entry date, putting in at least 20 hours of work. Matthew Piaskowski competed in the 3D animation competition in which he had to use an existing 3D character and animate them based on a supplied theme. Competing students had to apply the principles of animation to make their characters move and act in a convincing and appealing manner. Students, although working from home, had a time limit set to complete their work and were not permitted to seek input from their teachers and others. The Upper Canada District School Board is proud of our students' efforts and wish them the very best at the next level of competition. Perth, Ontario has a new high school graduate, Chair, Gordon Wallbank. By the age of 84, most seniors start to slow down. Not Gordon Wallbank. the father of 3 daughters, grandfather of 7, and great-grandfather of 3, who decided no matter how old you are, it is never too late to finish something that you had started. Starting with a few classes in computer studies, Gordon decided that he really wanted to finish high school. So here he is in 2021 at the age of 84 years old, graduating from high school. Gordon had a successful 33-year career at the National Film Board of Canada, from which he retired from in 1994. In 1999, he moved to Lanark, Ontario, and for 20 years he drove a school bus, a job he absolutely loved and was loved by his many students. He finally retired in 2019. And now he can also call himself a high school graduate. Since he was a young man, Gordon has been a Montreal Canadiens fan through and through, and is also known to have enjoyed a few baseball games over the years. Right now, Gordon continues to live in Lanark and enjoys his loving companion, a Springer Spaniel named Rocky, and his hobbies of photography, music, cooking, and especially baking his own tourtières. Now that Gord is a graduate, maybe one day he will truly begin to enjoy his retirement. Until then, go Habs go. Mr. Chair, we are learning and celebrating an Upper Canada District School Board. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would also like to extend my congratulations to both Connell and Matthew for their skills and real victory, as well as to Gordon from PDCI. So that's a wonderful story, and it's never too late to learn, and we're all on that journey, I hope. I guess it's time for me to make a few comments, and I'll be very brief, unusually. First thing I want to mention is it's been a very exciting few days for us who are involved in the Trustee Innovation Awards, which you are going to hear a lot about a little bit later, but I just wanted to say that next week as well, I will be on a bit of a roadshow to present the Service Excellence Awards. And these are very important events whereby we recognize the good work of our staffs. So anyway, I'll leave that till to Trustee Parisien. It's a little a bittersweet moment in a way, because tonight will be the final meeting for Director Sliwa, and I don't know if he's attending in person tonight or not, but as well for Director Sliwa and Acting Director Val Allen and Secretary of the Board, Mr. Richard. So we appreciate the efforts that you all have committed to in order to keep the wheels of this organization rolling, and rolling they have been. So thank you so much. I also would like to mention that, trustees, there will be a private session. I had hoped to avoid this, but it's unavoidable. There will be a public session on a very brief one on July the 6th at 6:30. So I just want you to give you a heads up. Finally, I would reiterate Acting Secretary Richard's comments about the Habs. It's a good Canadian story, so go Habs, go. And finally, our Vice Chair, Bill McPherson, has asked me if he could say a few words, so I'm going to turn this over to Bill.
Okay, thank you. After hearing Roger's report, my head's a little swollen here. 2 out of 3 of them, those kids came from Lanark, which is probably a pretty good thing. I would just like to, most of you are aware of the events that transpired at our residence 2 weeks ago, in which we had a rather large fire and consumed our former dairy barn, a hay barn, and as well as my workshop and one more outbuilding. We did manage to save the house, but it's not about me. I would like to offer simple thanks to members of the board for the conversations, the emails, the offers of support. I would like to thank the trustees Cram and Schooler for offering to step up and backfill me while I took 2 weeks off to clear my head. Special mention to Chair McAllister. Now, the firemen were still on the site, and my wife and I were sitting either on the veranda or on the tailgate of one of our trucks, and we observed this couple walking up the lane, stepping over fire hoses. It truly speaks of character. When Chair McAllister drove out, I don't know how he got around the police roadblocks, but he came up and spoke to me personally. His wife had made a fresh loaf of bread, and just saying, offer of support. Director Sliwa has a hidden calling. He too appeared the next day, and he makes the most amazing cranberry muffins that you have ever tasted. So in his retirement, I'm anticipating he's going to open a tea room with a specialty in muffins. The community, the board, I just want to say thank you. I'll be honest with you, the day after, I viewed this as the last straw. Now I'm simply looking at it as perhaps laying the first brick. Now I truly understand the value of community. So once again, thank you from myself and my family, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Bill. I love that analogy of the last straw and the first brick. We'll have to keep that in our repertoire somewhere. But Bill, we extend our sympathy for your loss, and we hope that you are recovering and know that the Upper Canada Board is behind you. I'm going to move to 1101, which is a report of the Special Education Advisory Committee. I have a motion moved by Trustee Cram, seconded by Trustee Barry, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve the revisions to the Special Education Plan for 2021-22 as presented June 16, 2021, based on the recommendation from the Special Education Advisory Committee, July. Anyway, so that's it. So I would, who is speaking to that? I guess Vice Chair?
Yeah, I can speak to it. I will admit I was absent that evening. However, this marks a culmination of 10 months of diligent work, and I am pleased to see that SEAC recommended it unanimously, and I would ask the trustees support the recommendation.
Are there any questions or comments? Hearing none, I would ask you, trustees, to cast your ballot, please.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We are going to move to 1102, which is a ratification of the Special Education Advisory Committee member. It's moved by Trustee Danaher, seconded by Trustee Swan, that the Upper Canada District School Board ratify the appointment of Lisa Flanagan, alternate representative, East Region Autism Ontario representative, to the Special Education Advisory Committee of the Upper Canada District School Board, effective July 1, 2021, until November 14, 2022. Trustees, would you please cast your ballot?
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
We are moving to 1201, which is the Upper Canada District School Board Director of Education work plan status update. I'm going to turn this over to Director Sliwa.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, may I interrupt for a second? Can we do the report of the Trustee Innovation Awards Committee from Trustee Parisien?
I thank you very much. I am so sorry. I had that on my radar, and I would be pleased to go back to that item. Before we do, my first comments are directed to Trustee Parisien, to whom I had assigned this file way back when she first ran, and Trustee Parisien ran with this file, and her history this year of 17 nominations is fantastic. And I know the recipients were especially appreciative of the recognition which we accorded them earlier in the week. In a big organization, it's the small things that count. I'm a more proud supporter of public education than ever before. And I'll have a bit more to say at the board meeting further about this, but I'm going to turn this over to Trustee Parisien to bring us some good news.
Thank you, Chair. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Yes? I hope so. All right.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So the Trustee Innovation Award Committee met prior to our nominations being submitted and went over how we would go about this year. This year was a full year of pandemic, and what potentially we would be looking for in innovation and what potentially we could receive as nominations. We wanted to make sure that we were really able to have nominations and, you know, seek what innovative ideas our staff are going through within the board. And this year, phenomenally, we received 17 applications, which may not seem like a lot, but it is a lot. And on top of that, we never even extended the deadline. So I'm really excited to see how much the Trustee Innovation Award is starting to be recognized throughout our board. And without further ado, I will let everyone know this year's winners. Yesterday, they were all invited to a sort of inconspicuous volunteer meeting. Some potentially thought they were there to be volunteered for another committee, yet they all came at 8 o'clock in the morning, ready to work, ready to participate, which was just great. And at that time, we sort of started the meeting off quite casually. And next thing you know, they were all learning that they had won the 2021 Trustee Innovation Award. And the emotion and reaction was just phenomenal. You'll get to see that as the year progresses in September, but the staff that received the award were just phenomenally grateful for being nominated and for being recognized for the work that they have done. So in no particular order, the recipients this year are Leanne Sachow, Bernadette Sauvé, Sam Crosby, Sherry Leader, Laura Oliver, Courtney Lozell, Bobby Moore, and Jennifer Peters. And I would like to congratulate again each and every one of you. I got to speak to you all yesterday, and the creative ideas and work that you are doing in our schools is without a doubt incredibly amazing. That not to say though, I don't want to miss out on the other nominations that we received. We did receive many others, and everyone this year made the selection process very difficult, because I gotta say we have some pretty phenomenal staff out there working and dedicating and going above and beyond and instilling great work and innovative ideas in our students. I would like to mention we did receive, I don't have his last name, but we did receive a nomination from a student, and his name is Dustin. And he nominated, I'm going to tell you, Sharon Stone, Lori Taylor, Nicole Cross, and Vice Principal David McDonald. And he just wanted them to know of a phenomenal job that they're doing, that he's really grateful that they are there, and they're there to support him. So I will be reaching out to Dustin to let him know that I really did appreciate his nomination as well. However, without further ado, our 8 winners tonight will have all been met, have all received letters, and in the fall we're going to be doing a presentation to the board with going to school, giving out the awards, and doing a sort of a segment as we did this year to highlight the innovative ideas that are going on in our schools and what the staff have been doing. So thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to every one of our committee members. It was a phenomenal year once again.
Thank you very much, Trustee Parisien. I have to tell you, at 8 o'clock in the morning on my way to Avonmore in the car, I participated in this meeting, and it was an emotional time for many of us. So great job, and thank you, Trustee Parisien. We thank you so much. We're moving to, I think, 1201 there now, the Director of Education's work plan. And for a status update, I'm going to turn this over to Director of Education, Stephen Slima.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, and thank you, trustees, for this opportunity to revisit and rejoin the board on this loose end, I would say, that is key to my concluding my service with the board, and at the same time that will be instrumental for our new director, Ron Ferguson, for taking full control of the work and responsibilities of leading the staff, and having a sense of direction and focus for the senior leadership team to bring to staff as we wrap up 2021, the calendar year. So it's my pleasure to bring to you what staff had looked at this year. And it's interesting, just as by way of an introduction this evening, is that we heard throughout the pandemic that we were all in this together as a way of trying to find, a common focus during a time of such great disruption. But what we've soon learned, at least in the K-12 education sector, is that different people found themselves impacted by the pandemic in different ways. And part of our work as staff, part of the direction that we received certainly from the Board of Trustees, was to ensure that we had closed those gaps, helped to develop an alignment in terms of attending to the needs that people have, and that if we were to identify where there seemed to have been a common need, the common need to reconnect and restart seems to be what's in front of all of us at this time. So, Mr. Chair, I thought it might be helpful just to walk through a brief PowerPoint rather than going through the going through the plan page by page, which I'm quite sure that folks have had the opportunity to do that already. And so I want to share with you, Mr. Chair and board, that what I hope that you'll glean from tonight's presentation is you'll get a better understanding of the key initiatives and priorities that the senior staff, and in fact all of our staff in the board, will be investing in for the remainder of this calendar year, and also a timeline for our reporting back to you. And just by way of a reminder about the journey that brought the director's work plan to your table this evening, it was a product of the board's multi-year strategic plan and the trustee work plan for this year. Our senior leadership team met from March to May to look at the different types of options and possibilities, and then identified some key initiatives that we would address. This is being brought to you this evening, of course, and then we have 2 report backs that align with the director's work, or sorry, the board's and trustee work plan direction to staff, and that is to report back in October. And then there are also some items that will be reporting back by the end of the calendar year, December 2021. Again, Mr. Chair, and for members of the board, the direction that you had in your work plan is quite clear to staff. Focus on the graduation rate increase by 1%. The focus on supporting staff about feeling safe, healthy, and productive as we continue to navigate through the pandemic. We all know that no one has made a declaration that the pandemic is over. We're very pleased that we're seeing improvements locally, regionally, and across the country, but we are still working in that current circumstance, and so the trustee work plan and the director's work plan has to be responsive to that. Of course, at the core of our work is always our students, and we need to be looking at what does it mean to connect students and reconnect students to their school, their class, and to their teacher as we move through the pandemic and the post-pandemic period. And lastly, without community, our schools don't have all that they need, and so we want to always draw on the support of the community and its goodwill. And how do we continue to invest in that, both at the school level and at the organizational level? So it would come as no surprise then, Mr. Chair, that the overview of the director's work plan is a mirror image of what's happening in the trustees' work plan, because indeed they are sides of the same coin. The staff will be looking at graduation rates, building and engaging dialogue around staff culture, feeling safe, healthy, and productive, supporting our students to feel that connection, and of course working with community and community stakeholders. Here's the details for those who haven't had a full opportunity to digest the work plan that we've presented to the board tonight and that you may have seen in your package in preparation for tonight's meeting. We know that our grad coach model is a real winner, and it's making the difference to support students in good second teaching of what happens in the regular classroom, and for staff and for our school-based staff to work with district staff to unite together in that common goal of getting our students across the finish line at any grade and stage. Particularly in action item number 2, we're going to be continuing our efforts to work down the line, not only on where students are at in their last 2 semesters of study or last 4 quadmesters, but in this case to confirm that we are keeping a high rate of achievement and a constant focus on students in grade 11 who are preparing obviously for their graduation outcome that would come in 4 semesters. And then lastly, building coherence and alignment around the student success team model in our elementary schools. We know that it's firmly in place in our secondary schools. Now's the time to make sure that we have the same kind of forum and the same type of dialogue and support to keep ushering the conversation around students of mystery and of need all the way through elementary until their graduation year in grade 12. Mr. Chair, staff culture is also a focus, and we know that the board is focusing in their own work plan on our staff feeling safe, healthy, and productive. And if we want to know what it means to get to those outcomes, the bottom line is that we have to ask people how they are, how they're doing, and how are they seeing our initial efforts to work on those 3 elements of safety, health, and productivity while we're still working our way through the pandemic. You have heard, Mr. Chair, through some of our discussions that I've had with the board in terms of my own appraisal about how there were steps last fall working with Executive Superintendent Hobbs and our Superintendent of HR, Ron Ferguson, on doing pandemic surveys with our business office staff and field office staff as a dry run about how to collect just-in-time information about how staff are feeling about their return to work, because we know that the stay-at-home orders do end eventually and people would be integrating back to work. If they are integrating back to work in the business offices, in what measure, in whole or in part, because we've also seen remote work as being an reasonable opportunity for some job categories, some job classifications, and what does that mean in light of our administrative procedure that we've introduced last year that helps to govern and inform remote work requests. We also want to continue to talk to our employees about their advice and insights about smooth transition of students and our employees back to the workplace in the fall. So this is our second run at this, of course, Mr. Chair. The first run at it was September 2020. Then we had sort of a short turnaround in February 2021 when there was a limited closure and the stay-at-home order was in effect. But we've had a longer hiatus this time around. Almost of equal time as it was last spring. And so what did we learn from that experience? What does it mean to start up schools in a way that builds on the success of what we experienced last year? And I guess finally, Mr. Chair, also important is to understand that there's a larger discussion that the board is courageously wanting to undertake around equity, inclusivity, and diversity. And we are well on our way to bringing in an external party to begin the conversations about what does it mean to develop inclusive, equitable, and diverse workplace environments, and how does our employees see the way forward on that. Mr. Chair, obviously school staff culture and student culture are top of our minds because the human element is what our organization is all about. And so we're looking at two particular items to reconnect students with their school, classroom, and teachers. The first one is to talk about what does it mean to create safe and positive spaces for students and to have a voice in how we're doing so far and what we need to do next. As well, we are of a view that all the signals that are coming from the Ministry of Education is that co-curricular, extracurricular activities will begin in small increments and in a very guided way next school year. The Upper Canada District School Board understands the value of that. Each of our schools and our staff understand the value of that. Students do miss that experience, and we know the Ministry of Education is currently planning to give guidance about what does it mean to restart up certain activities that our students are involved in. What we would want to do, of course, is collect the insight about how our students are thinking about the return to clubs, sports, and performances, because that is part of the student experience, and we would like to understand what their thoughts, questions, and needs are after this long disconnect from that very enjoyable part of the student life since last March of 2020. Lastly, Mr. Chair, no surprise that the board had identified in its work plan an emphasis on community connections. So staff will be engaging in a three-tier approach in terms of its initiatives. One is going to be the confirmation about where can we connect with the community that would enhance student program experiences, particularly around experiential learning, because that will be a very key and very attractive entity for students returning back to face-to-face programming. We also know that the board is interested in the notion of having a external committee with regards to equity and inclusivity. We already have a staff-driven group or committee right now, I should say, and it's served us extremely well. But from what we just heard from when Superintendent Coombs presented the equity and diversity plan, part of the external review is also to give insight and recommendations about how that could proceed, and then the staff would obviously want to support the board in any direction it would choose. And then lastly, Mr. Chair, the final initiative is around service learning. Service learning has been always part of education. It's gone through different labels over the last 50 years, everything from citizenship to community involvement and character education. It's time for us to have a check-in on what does the community view community involvement and service learning to be as a valuable experience for young people. Well, what does that look like? Particularly since during the pandemic, there has been some changes in terms of the type and hours to accommodate this graduation requirement for our secondary school students. When we get back on track, I would imagine that there'll be some new expectations, some new experiences, and a question about what would the community want to see more of or less of when it comes to service learning, and what does it mean to support the community, support our neighbors. So, Mr. Chair, that finishes my recap of the plan. I'm really pleased that I could bring that to you. I want to give a shout out to Superintendent Ferguson and to Director Designate Val Allen, who was influential in the efforts to support this dialogue moving forward through the senior team, but also the fact and a tip of the hat to the senior team who had done really great things under such extraordinary circumstances, including looking beyond today's challenges and today's demands of what does it mean to operate the school system during a global pandemic, the crisis of a lifetime, to thinking about we're going to be out of this at some point. What does it mean to start to build towards that, and how do we honor the trustees' work plan with some intentional moves on the part of senior staff and by extension all staff of the board. Mr. Chair, I'll turn that back over to you to see if there's any comments.
Thank you very much, Director. Trustees, do you have any questions or comments on the proposed work plan? Director Sliwa, it appears as if it is very clear. I want to thank you for this this work plan, which is based, of course, on the strategic plan and the trustee work plan. It seems that we are well positioned there now to address the future, and we are building for the future in a way that is very constructive and positive. So thank you so much, Director, for your leadership of the team, and for your team's work in achieving your goals. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's been a pleasure.
We are moving to 1202, Student Trustees Year in Review. And before I turn this over to Student Trustee Kane, unfortunately, Student Trustee Jordan is not able to join us this evening, but I just want to point out that Trustee Liaison Officer Workman and I met last week in Kemptville with the two student trustees. to present them with their gift in a special photo book, which was prepared by Lisa, and it commemorated the work that they had done over the past year. And at that time, I mentioned to them that they had conducted a number of surveys with regard to female menstrual products, as well as student mental health, and that has guided our policies and procedures since then. So that is a significant impact that you have had. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Student Trustee Tane Hughes.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, trustees. Tonight I will be presenting our end-of-year review, summarizing our four student senate meetings that took place this year. The first meeting was October 16th, 2020, and we began the meeting with reviewing the process of how the student senators got their role in Student Senate. We then determined that in a board as large and diverse as the Upper Canada District School Board, having a diverse ways of how to elect student senators is not such a bad thing. We also conducted a survey of student senators to ensure that we had representation across multiple learning platforms, and we found that there were student senators in every type of learning. We then reviewed the Student Senate Handbook, and senators proposed a couple of changes, including adding the contact information for our current student trustees, as well as adding terminology to include online meetings. We also discussed the positive and negative impacts of COVID-19 to students at length. Some of the positive impacts including teachers having improved on using online resources, teachers and students having adapted to online learning, smaller class sizes, and teachers more understanding of workload. Some of the negatives included the inability to host regular events, such as gym class or extracurriculars. Classes were longer than usual, and it was difficult to make the grade 9s feel welcome as we were in school the entire year. The second meeting took place December 4th, 2020. We kicked off the meeting by displaying the changes we had made to the Student Senate Handbook, and we next had a lengthy discussion on best practices based on the topics student senators had suggested in the first meeting. Senators took to the floor to discuss best practices from their schools about increasing student spirit, mental health resources, and increasing student involvement. Some of the best practices shared were as follows: increasing student spirit, mental health resources, increasing student involvement, school-wide cahoots, posters, and school-wide announcements, food drives and emails, clubs and council meetings on Teams, themed school spirit weeks, and newsletters from hotlines lifting different websites to visit, and increased use on social media. Next, we discussed the Quadmaster System and listed some pros and cons. Some of the pros senators listed were less homework, longer breaks, and more time in class. And the cons the senators listed were course content goes by too fast, grade 12s weren't sure if they were being prepared for post-secondary, and missing one day of school is the equivalent of missing 2 days in a regular school year. Finally, we discussed and decided on 3 different student survey questions to be featured in February's student survey. The questions we developed were, do students feel prepared for university? And has the lack of exams impacted this? Has COVID-19 or the current learning style affected your mental health? And do you feel more stress or anxiety due to COVID-19 or the current learning style? Our third meeting, taking place on February 26, 2021, began with the electoral process. We then introduced the 5 candidates for the 2021 to 2022 student trustee. Student senators, staff, and trustees were given the opportunity to pose questions to the candidates. The 5 candidates presented their speeches. Then was the balloting of voting members, and the announcement of the 2021-2022 student trustees, Bradford Ward and Michelle Ellie. We then proceeded with the regular student senate meeting with a review and update of the student survey and discussion on the hiring of the new director of education. Overall, I believe that this was a very successful student senate meeting, as we not only conducted the student trustee election, but we did it virtually. The fourth and final student senate meeting took place at April 23rd, 2021. We gave update on the following information: the student survey results, and the implementation of feminine hygiene products in the UCDSB. And the student senators discussed students' council productivity and student involvement, and student senators' final remarks. The 2021-2022 student trustees, Bradford Ward and Michelle Ali, gave an introduction to student senate and discussed future ideas. And then finally, student trustee Evans and I gave our final remarks to the student senate. That concludes our report. I would like to say thank you to all the student senators, trustees, our trustee mentors, Trustee Cram and Parisian, Chair McAllister, Director Sliwa, and most of all, Lisa Workman, for the tremendous guidance and support you offered in our roles as student trustee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Student Trustee Tain. I know Student Trustee Jordan is on the line. Would you like to say anything, Jordan? I know he was not able to appear, so I just wanted to...
Mr. Chair, I think one of his problems is he's having trouble unmuting. So I think he can hear you, but he might be unable to unmute and then speak. Okay.
Anyway, Jordan, thank you again for your service as a student trustee. And, you know, for what you really have done is, and what we expect you to do, is to represent the student voice at the board table. And I think based on your report this evening, Student Trustee Tain, you have done exactly that. And I hope that we have listened and acted upon your recommendations. And finally, we wish you the very best in your educational endeavors in the future, next year. And I think our world is in good hands, having listened to you and what you have to say. And finally, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Ashal and Bradford, our new student trustees, and we look forward to working with you. And I also want to note the support that I have received, as well as from as well as the trustees, student trustees, from Trustee Cram and Trustee Parisien. Your guidance to these young people have been remarkable and noteworthy. So thank you so much. So it appears, thank you very much. We're now going to move to 1203, which is the update on operations management priorities and practices. And I'm going to turn this over to Acting Secretary of the Board, Roger Bouchard, Marshall McNair, Superintendent of Schools, and Susan Ruthers, Superintendent of Schools. So take it away.
Thank you, Chair. The purpose of the report this evening is, you gathered, I'm sure, is to update the board with respect to monthly operational practices and priorities for our school district in light of the public health crisis related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Given the ongoing global pandemic and with the startup of the new school operational year for 2020-21, trustees requested that staff provide a monthly update on school and program operations and to highlight key developments related to the operation of schools and the delivery of programs for students in grades K to 12. Superintendents McNair and Rudders will review for the board this evening, Chair, operational highlights related to vaccination for youth aged 12 to 17, graduations and leaving ceremonies, the retrieval of personal belongings and drop off at school resources, And finally, the Upper Canada District School Board's re-engagement strategy for the 2021-22 school year. Chair Superintendent McNair will begin the review, followed by Superintendent Rudders, and I pass it over to Superintendent McNair to begin.
Through you, Chair. Thank you. I just want to confirm you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Right, thank you. Through you, Chair, I'm pleased to share a few topics during this evening's operational update. First of all, I wanted to share that during this week and next week, our public health partners from Lanark, Leeds and Grenville Health Unit and the Eastern Ontario Health Unit are providing opportunities for youth over 12 years of age and their families to receive their vaccination. We have continued our partnership with our public health agencies to share various communications and promote the locations of these clinics throughout our district. I also wanted to update our Board of Trustees on the UCDSB participation in asymptomatic testing throughout the district, which commenced on March 20th, 2021. 418 staff or students have visited one of our host secondary schools over the last few months. These results do not include Saturday, June 12th, as those have not been updated on the ministry site as of yet. And we have one more scheduled testing date, Saturday, June 9th at Gananoque Intermediate and Secondary School. Our third-party vendor, GVT Labs, reports no positive cases at any of our targeted testing sites. It is also important to know that, as you know, we have nearly 2,600 students in our board and approximately 4,000 employees within UCDSB. Out of this nearly 30,000 people associated with our schools, less than 1% have tested positive with COVID-19 during the 2020-2021 school year. This amounts to only 156 positive cases, which speaks to the outstanding effort of everyone to follow public health directions in our communities and, of course, in our schools. And I'd like to take a moment and sincerely thank our public health partners at Lanark, Leeds and Grenville Health Unit and Eastern Ontario Health Unit for their continued guidance and support throughout this school year. I would also tonight, through you, Chair, like to provide a brief update about graduations and leaving ceremonies. In an effort to provide a personalized graduation experience while still adhering to safety measures, all of our schools have planned an in-person portion for graduation celebrations for our grade 12 students. We once again have partnered with our local public health officials and they continue to support our plans. Our schools have coordinated either a drive-through event or home delivery of diplomas, awards, bursaries, scholarships, certificates, and a memento. This portion of our celebration will also be included in the virtual ceremonies congratulating the class of 2021. For grade 6 students leaving their school or graduating grade 8 students, plans are well underway to also provide a virtual ceremony that will celebrate these students in a safe and unique way. We know teachers across our system will celebrate all students as they wrap up an unprecedented school year. The commitment of all of our school staff while adhering to public health safety measures has been incredible. Thank you to our staff, students, and our families for all your ongoing support. And lastly, tonight, I would like to share that our schools are in the process of organizing access to our school buildings so staff can retrieve personal belongings, assist with packing up some student belongings that are still at the school, as well as attending to their own classrooms or workplace needs. Families will be hearing directly from their child's school by the end of the day tomorrow at the latest, if they haven't already, regarding the procedure and the dates organized so that parents, guardians, and students can visit their school to retrieve personal belongings, as well as drop off any materials or devices that belong to the school. It continues to be a priority for us, for our staff, students, and our families, that we adhere to the public health measures, which would include physical distancing, mask wearing, and COVID-19 screening prior to visiting our schools. Areas will be designated outside of each of the schools for pickup and drop off. This concludes my verbal report of the operational update tonight, Chair, and I would be happy to answer any questions that yourself or the Board of Trustees may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Superintendent McNair. I will open the floor to questions.
I have a comment, Chair.
Trustee Cram, go ahead.
Thank you. Just a comment. I did attend one of the vaccine clinics on Monday this week in Elmont, and fortunately, I now have my second vaccine, so I can yell whoop whoop. But what impressed me more at the clinic was the way the public health nurses and the RNs who are administering the shots took some time to talk to our students there was one particularly who was 12 and having some apprehension about getting the shots, and just the humane way that they dealt with the students was just absolutely fantastic.
Thank you, Trustee Cram. I certainly can echo the efficiency that I've experienced at the Brockville Memorial Center in these vaccinations. Trustees, any further questions? Hearing none, I'm going to move to item 1204, the 2020-2021
Mr. Chair,
financial
if I believe Superintendent Rudders has to do the re-engagement strategy now that Superintendent McNair is done.
I'm sorry, Superintendent Rudders. Proceed.
Through you, Chair, and no worries at all. It's my pleasure just to be here for a few minutes with the board tonight to update you on our current efforts to re-engage students who've been participating in homeschooling during the 2020-21 school year. And so what we've recognized over the course of the pandemic, and in particular during this school year, is that we've seen an increase in the number of families choosing to homeschool their children. And of course, we attribute that to the pandemic. We certainly want to encourage these families to register once again with us and our community schools, and we want to see these students rejoin their peers and their classmates in the fall of 2021. So from a numbers perspective, we've been able to identify 283 elementary students and 16 secondary students who were expected to be with us for this past school year. And those students either didn't return at all last September, or they left us at points during the school year for the purpose of homeschooling. And so over the course of this week, our school principals have been reaching out with personal phone calls to each of these families to invite them back to learning in our schools for next year. We're encouraging these families to come in and register as soon as possible so that we are best able to prepare for their arrival and include their children in our classes for the next school year. Our principals will continue to work throughout the next several days on this task, and then we'll provide the senior team with a summary of the results of their re-engagement efforts a little bit in the beginning of next week. Anecdotally, I had one principal reach out to me yesterday to indicate that his conversation with one family resulted in 4 children re-registering for next year. And so this is certainly very encouraging, and we're hopeful that other schools are recognizing similar positive results in these communications. The real measure of our success, of course, will become clear as we see these new registrations show up in our student enrollment numbers between now and the start of school in the fall. And at that time, I think we'll be better able to offer trustees more specific information on how this strategy may have positively impacted our overall enrollments for the 21-22 school year. And so that concludes my brief update on our homeschooling re-engagement strategy. And I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions that the trustees may have.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Rudders. Are there any questions?
Yes, please.
Go ahead, Trustee Barry.
Through you, Sarah, would you repeat those numbers, please? 283 elementary, secondary?
Certainly, it was 283 elementary students and 16 secondary students.
16 seems like a very small number.
Well, it is. I would agree with you. I think the attachment of credits potentially at the secondary level may have something to do with the higher level of engagement of secondary students throughout the pandemic.
Thank you.
Further questions? Trustee Superintendent Runners, I'm really interested in what you termed the re-engagement strategy, and I'm going to repeat myself. I'm sounding like a broken record, but I feel strongly, very strongly, that the best learning for a student is that which occurs in the relationship between a student, their teacher, their educational assistants, and their support personnel, and their schools and principals, and the resources that are there to help them directly. So, and you know, our slogan is "Our family welcomes yours," and that is no more so true than now. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So, have we concluded this section, since I tend to overrun some things?
Mr. Chair, that's fine. We can move on. Yes.
Thank you. So, Mr. Hobbs, you are up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll
Please.
just queue up my presentation here so that trustees can follow along. And that will just take me 1 second. Hopefully. Are you able to see my presentation, Mr. Chair?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So just like to thank trustees for the opportunity to entertain yet another finance presentation. I think there's been one at almost every meeting this year on a variety of topics. At our the trustees' last meeting, we were able to present the budget for the 21-22 school year starting in September, which was passed. And tonight it's my pleasure to flip back a page, if you will, and bring you the final financial forecast for the current fiscal year. So in other words, the finance department's best estimate of how we're going to end up this current year ending August 31st, 2021. So this evening, we'd like to touch on 4 main areas, one of which is we'll give you a brief executive summary of the presentation, speak to you a little bit about the background that informs the presentation and the work that has informed the estimates you'll see this evening. We'll have an opportunity to unpack the financial forecast in somewhat more detail, and then, of course, wrap up for your questions. So by way of executive summary, here we are on slide 3. To get right to the last page of the novel, financial forecast number 3 anticipates an in-year operational surplus of $3.4 million for the current fiscal year, ending August 31st, 2021. And that is based on the funding information we've received to date, as well as a more refined estimate of the entire year's expenses using feedback that's been gathered from administration over the course of the last month or so, then assembled by the finance department. So should this $3.4 million surplus in year come to fruition, the board would of course be compliant with all ministry requirements for the ending balance at the end of the school year, and the accumulated surplus available for compliance available to the board would increase to $14.5 million. So again, just reminding trustees that we have 2 kinds of surpluses or deficits, as the case may be. An in-year surplus, which represents what's happening in the current fiscal year. And we also have the accumulated surplus, which represents the sum total of all in-year surpluses or deficits up to the end of the last complete fiscal year. So that $3.4 million surplus, if it comes to fruition at the end of August, we would be left with a sum total accumulated surplus of $14.5 million. By contrast, just to remind you, financial forecast number 2, we delivered on March 24th, 2021. And I believe at that time we were still in the throes of trying to learn whether we were going to be in a longer term lockdown and how long that might be. But at that point, we estimated an in-year deficit for the 2020-21 school year of $1.1 million, which would have resulted in a drop to our accumulated surplus available for compliance at year end, and that would have left us at $10 million. So what you're seeing this evening is our current estimate is a fairly significant improvement in the financial outlook from financial forecast number 2 to number 3. And that's really primarily attributable to lower than expected expenditures due to the extended COVID-related lockdown period that was initiated after financial forecast number 2. And again, just recalling that it's only been, I think, a couple of weeks since their determination was made that schools would not be going back for the remainder of the school year. And of course, we've done our best to actually integrate some of the impacts of that into our forecasting as well. Of course, the monitoring and controlling of the expenditures continues on a month-to-month and week-to-week and day-to-day basis, and staff will continue to monitor expenses and funding closely as we complete the 2020-21 fiscal year and transition into the new year in September. And I would say, generally speaking, we're not anticipating much, if any, change in the revenue side of things or the funding side of things, and in fact, things haven't changed dramatically in a number of months on the funding side. But we do anticipate that there will be, continued uncertainty to some extent in expenditures, for better or for worse, to some extent over the course of the next couple of months as we see how things shake out. So just to remind trustees again, and this is something that actually trips me up a little bit, even as we're sort of in the throes as a team of going back and forth between next year's budget and current year's financial monitoring and forecasting. But again, just a quick recap of this slide. Trustees know that in the course of any given school year, Finance Department is working with 2 or 3 at any given time years. In the fall, we're oftentimes trying to close out the previous fiscal year. And then moving into the winter, we start forecasting or providing forecasts for the current fiscal year and how things are going to pan out. And then, of course, in the late spring, we really start working to support trustees in their deliberations around the budget for the upcoming year. And so, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, at the trustees' last meeting, the budget for next year, which we also call original estimates for the 21-22 school year, was passed. And tonight, we're really talking about the current fiscal year and how we see that panning out. So just to orient everyone to where we stand. A little bit of background, and this is a bit of a recap, but just it's always, I think, important for us to go back and think about where we've been, recognizing for us sometimes, and probably for you too, it seems that we're just back in August of 2020 trying to figure out how we were going to open the school year in September of 2020. But back in July 15th of 2020, the original budget for this current year forecasted an in-year surplus of $0.2 million or $200,000. And that would have led to an accumulated surplus available for compliance at August 31st at the end of this year of $11 million. So that was our original budget. We were forecasting for this year a surplus of $200,000 and an accumulated surplus of $11 million. In January and March, trustees were presented with the first and second financial forecast for this year. So we're into the year. We know that the first few months of the year especially were really fast and furious, with lots of expenses piling up and governments throwing additional funding to support the COVID pandemic response. And you'll recall that financial forecast number 1, which we presented, all of a sudden changed that $200,000 per in-year surplus. We started forecasting a $2.9 million deficit, again, really driven by a rapid explosion in expenses related to COVID, and also explosion, but not quite as fast as the expenses in additional funding. Coming back to financial forecast number 2, which we presented in March, right at the front end of the current lockdown, we projected an improvement to the board's anticipated financial position, but we were still at that point projecting a $1.1 million in-year deficit. And in addition, as you'll recall, while these are our three formal financial forecasts, you'll recall probably back in the October 2020 timeframe, we presented an initial outlook at what our deficit posture could be should all of our expenses come to fruition and no additional funding was provided. And at that point, it could have been as bad as around $17 million deficit in October 2020. So throughout the course of the years, we've done our regular monitoring and forecasting, and we've also tried to assist in digesting what the known and unknown impacts of COVID could be. I would say it would be fair to say it was a especially volatile year financially and in an awful lot of other ways as well. So the purpose of our presentation tonight, of course, is to provide that third formal forecast of the board's financial position at year-end 2020-21. And then we'll close out the year over the course of the next couple months and then move into the fall, at which our auditors come in and give us the definitive view of how the 2020-21 school year went from a financial perspective. So slide 6 then, we're going to jump into the financial forecast detail this evening about how we arrived at this estimate. And so one of the things that we try to do as well is look at projected enrollment, which we'll unpack here on slide 7, titled, of course, Projected Enrollment. And really what we tried to do in the top slide is give you just the evolution of enrollments between financial forecast number 2 and forecast number 3. Just to take trustees back to September of 2020, you'll recall that we were really initially surprised in September, October 2020 because we were down well over 600 pupils or students that actually showed up compared to the estimates that informed our budget, which we passed on July 15th of last year. And of course, when you're down 600, 700 students, that has an enormous financial impact on the organization. We lose an awful lot of funding, but because we've already committed to the staffing out of necessity and the expenses that are associated with supporting those kids who didn't show up, it's really hard to back out of those expenses. So that would, in ordinary years, that would lead to an automatic deficit situation virtually in the multi-millions. Fortunately, the government came along in the fall and provided stabilization funding that basically treated it as though we would get the funding that we had originally budgeted. And so that was probably this year one of the greatest, from a funding standpoint, reliefs that we received as an organization to sort of stabilize the organization in a time of great churn. But enrollment-wise, what we've seen since that time is that things have been largely stable in year. So in the financial forecast number 2, our total pupils of the board at that point, our recent counts was 25,948. And since that time, it's been up slightly to 26,098 for a total increase of 150 students between financial forecast number 2 and financial forecast number 3. And, you know, as Superintendent Rudders indicated, going into the next year, as you know from our budget presentation last week, some of the guidance we received from the Ministry of Education was that stabilization funding would not be provided in the 21-22 school year. So it was necessary for us to begin our planning and our expense commitments for the upcoming year in a conservative posture. In other words, not just assuming that our enrollments would bounce back to the pre-COVID levels. Instead, start our planning with lower levels and hope that as those kids trickle in, we can add the supports that are necessary, teaching and otherwise, to support those students where they turn up, and you know, the funding will also flow to support those students when they actually turn up. So we're cautiously optimistic that we will hopefully go upward from here. So moving on to slide 8, the purpose here of this slide really is not just to show you where that $3.4 million forecasted in-year surplus available for compliance comes from, or how we got there, but it's also to remind you a little bit about the evolution, recognizing that the original budget that we pass every year is really just a forecast of our revenue and expenses that we're going to incur in the year, and then we do reforecast throughout the course of the year. Numbers 1, 2, and 3. And so if I were to look at the line of this table on slide 8 that says total revenue for compliance, what you can see that's occurred here is that our revenue has grown quite significantly from $376.2 million estimated in the original budget for this fiscal year that was passed in July of last year, up to $389.5 million by the time we got to financial forecast number 1 in January, up further to $393.1 million in March, and then largely stable from that time, March to now. So really up by about $0.7 million or $700,000. What you can also see, of course, is that the expenses have similarly jumped, and you know, from $376 million original estimates from our original budget for 2020-21 to $392.4 million, you know, $16 million in that one interval alone from July to January 2021, and then up by modestly to $394.2 million in our forecast that we were forecasting in March of 2021, and actually now, since that time, down a little bit to 390.4, a favorable variance of $3.8 million, which I'll unpack a little bit. So the moral of the story that you're seeing here is that a little bit more revenue from financial forecast number 2 to number 3, but quite a significant drop in the estimated expenses that we're going to occur from financial forecast number 2 to number 3. And that's really what that driver is for us, having that $3.4 million favorable variance from financial forecast number 2 to number 3. The last line on this table where it says annual surplus/deficit for compliance, this is really where you see the evolution over time through each of these successive estimates of the surplus we were projecting, or deficit as the case may be, for this fiscal year. So initially on the bottom line in the original budget, we were projecting a $200,000 surplus. By the time we got to January, that had dropped down to a $2.9 million deficit. Things had slightly improved by March, and we were forecasting a $1.1 million deficit, and now things have improved quite a bit to the point where we're forecasting a $3.4 million surplus to year end. And if what I'd like to do now then is maybe unpack that a little bit for you. So slide 9 here, the main contributors to that improvement. What are the main contributors to the change from financial forecast number 2 to financial forecast number 3? So how do we get from a $1.1 million deficit to a $3.4 million surplus? A very significant swing. As I mentioned earlier, I think the one thing that is important for us to keep in mind here is that virtually the root cause of this in our mind is entirely a result of the fact that we've been in lockdown, and I believe the number is I think we've actually had 34% of the we've been in school 34% of the available instructional days for the entire year. So that remaining 66% of the days that we've been out obviously has an impact in reducing the expenses that we would normally incur to provide learning and support for our students. So on row 1 here, lower than previously forecasted COVID-related expenses, we're forecasting $1.9 million lower than forecasted expenses. This is primarily driven by the absence of need for us to buy PPE to support operations in schools. So that expense that we thought we were going to have is not necessary owing to the lockdown posture to the end of the year, which means that we don't have to spend that $1.9 million. Number 2, line 2, change in instructional staff costs. When we have replacement costs associated with staff sickness and absences in schools of all types, that gets charged centrally after a period of days. And obviously the replacement costs, we're not incurring the replacement costs nearly at the rate that we would have had we had a full-blown in-school operation. Schools fully functioning, so we're anticipating $1.6 million in lesser costs associated with really primarily replacement of school staff. There's been a bit of underspending to the tune of about $400,000 in board admin and to some extent some facilities costs, somewhat related to lack of community use being in operation. So that's the forecasted expenditure is less than expected by $400,000. As trustees saw, line 4, of course, with schools not being in, schools are responsible for the first few days of replacement of staff, and then that gets kicked over to a central admin. But we're anticipating that because of the lockdown, there will be $300,000 less in school budget spending. Again, distinct from school-generated funds. This isn't. This is distinct from the fundraising kind of activity that or fundraising funds that schools would have in their accounts. This is really the budget that's provided to support the operations of schools, so anticipating $300,000 less in expenditure there. A favorable variance in the transportation surplus of $200,000. That's really driven by just simply less operation of home to school activity, transporting kids from home to school. So we see that as being, again, a $200,000 favorable variance. And then there's $100,000 in assorted other changes in a variety of areas that is also a favorable variance. And what you see here, therefore, is that we have basically $4.5 million favorable variance from the $1.1 million deficit that we forecast in March. If you add negative $1.1 million deficit and add a favorable $4.5 million to that, you get a forecasted surplus of $3.4 million for the current fiscal year. So again, this slide is really just to emphasize the fact that we're always in mind that we have to both pass a compliant plan to satisfy the Ministry of Education, and we need to keep our actual financial results in bounds with compliance. And so again, that means that for this particular year, we were allowed potentially, if needed, to run a deficit of up to 2% of our operating allocation, which amounted to potentially a $6.7 million deficit. And of course, if we're ending the year with a $3.4 million surplus, that's well within the threshold of compliance and not a worry. And as I indicated earlier, we are also, one of the compliance criteria for us is that we must spend within the administration and governance envelope, or no more than the administration and governance envelope. And we're actually a little bit underspent there, so also compliant as well. So finally, trustees will remember, as always, this slide, and I showed it, to be honest with you, I showed this slide last week, very similar slide for the upcoming school year in the context of the budget presentation, and then I got myself a little confused about this one, having to remember that we're now talking about the current year, not next year. Trustees will also remember that when we talk about an accumulated surplus, there's really two major parts to that accumulated surplus. There's the available for compliance part of the surplus, and there's the part that is unavailable for compliance. And the part of the surplus that's available for compliance is in fact itself composed of two parts. One is the operating accumulated surplus, which is just generally available. It has no restrictions attached to it. And then there's a portion of that surplus available for compliance that is internally appropriated. In other words, trustees or a previous board has designated that those funds are sort of, if you will, voluntarily sweatered. In theory, all of the funds that are available for compliance are entirely available for compliance. It's just that there's that designation of internally appropriated that applies to some of them. Primarily school budget related and a few other uses like Champions for Kids funds and so on. So really on this slide, slide 11, which is the detail of the projected accumulated surplus as of August 31st, what we're trying to do is say, if we run a $3.4 million deficit or surplus, if that pans out to the end of the school year, our accumulated surplus, which is the sum total of all of our in-year surpluses and deficits for our history, what's that $3.4 million in-year surplus going to do? Well, I just draw your attention really here to line 3, the total accumulated surplus or deficit available for compliance. Line 3 is highlighted in blue on your screen. And as you may recall, at the start of this fiscal year, our total accumulated surplus available for compliance was $11.1 million, driven largely actually by a similar situation, but that occurred last year, where the lockdown resulted in a dramatic curtailing of expenses in the last part of the last school year, and therefore we ended up with a larger than expected surplus at the end of the year, which went on to our accumulated surplus available for compliance. So we started the year with $11.1 million. In the second column, if we add $3.4 million of our in-year surplus available for compliance, that will bring us to, at August 31st, 2021, to a total of $14.5 million accumulated surplus available for compliance. The only other thing I think on this slide that I would draw your attention to is the last row, which is the externally appropriated portion. It's unavailable for compliance, and particularly the middle column where it says $3.7 million. And trustees will remember that predominantly that amount consists of our long-standing obligation to incur an expense annually to fund a future retirement gratuity liability. And this $3.7 million is a reflection of the fact that we are putting that money away in 2020-21. And you'll recall from our similar slide 2 weeks ago that for next year, that's almost zero, because this is the last year that we have to put that amount away. So the reason why you're seeing that there is just a reflection of the fact that this is the last year where we have to put an amount of that magnitude away and to satisfy our obligation to fund that future liability. So moving on to slide 12 then, what we just graphically wanted to show you is what you've seen already tonight, and I think a reflection of the volatility that we've all experienced this year. Again, our original budget for 2020-21 forecasted a $0.2 million or $200,000 surplus. Excuse me. By the time we got to financial forecast number 1, there had been, I think, lots of angst and concern about the enormous number of additional expenses we were going to incur to support the COVID response, but also a pretty serious flow of funds from various levels of government to support the response. So by the time we got to January, we were forecasting an in-year deficit of $2.9 million. Financial forecast number 2, things improved slightly, driven somewhat by the appearance of further funding and also further refinement about our expense estimates, particularly around PPE, where the burn rate that we were experiencing in the fall just didn't continue to pan out or stay at that level. So things got a little better. And of course, right almost around the same time that we presented that financial forecast number 2, we went into lockdown, which has really been the prime driver of pretty dramatic or significant expense reduction, curtailment over the course of the last few months that we feel will lead to a surplus in year in the neighborhood of $3.4 million. Slide 13 then, this really shows you, again, distinct from the in-year surplus, which we covered on the last slide. This is showing how we see things panning out for the accumulated surplus available for compliance. Again, the sum total of our historical in-year surpluses or deficits. So again, as I mentioned on a previous slide, we started this year, or we ended last year, should I say, with an $11.1 million accumulated surplus available for compliance. Moving on to the next bar, if we run a $3.4 million in-year surplus this year, that gets added to the $11.1 million, leaving us with $14.5 million. And trustees, of course, know that last week they passed a original budget for 21-22 that forecasts a $400,000 surplus for 21-22. And if that in turn comes to fruition, that would leave us with that $400,000 would get added to the $14.5 million at the end of next year, leaving us with $14.9 million in surplus available for compliance. So in summary, Financial forecast number 3, we're anticipating a $3.4 million in-year surplus, which is an improvement, of course, from the $1.1 million deficit projected in financial forecast number 2, driven primarily due to lower than expected expenses associated with the COVID lockdown of recent months. If we realize that $3.4 million in-year surplus, that would increase the board's accumulated surplus available for compliance from $11.1 million at the start of 2021 to $14.5 million at year end. I think that the important thing to recognize is that this is really a forecast. So it's by far, I would say, certainly not just a random estimate. But this is really driven, that the forecast is driven by a comprehensive feedback gathering exercise that draws on the input of schools and administrative departments. So we feel we've gathered broad input, but there also remains considerable uncertainty. And I would say probably driven primarily by what the startup of the school year starts to look like. And if there are expenses, for example, we may choose to incur this year to prepare as we did last year for the startup of the school year. And there's also, I think, uncertainty in terms of people's ability to follow through on spending plans that they may have had a month ago, for example, when we were gathering this information. And then finally, as always, a final authoritative view of the actual financial results for 2020-21 will be presented in late fall of 2021 with the audited financial statements. And that's just the regular business cycle that represents the authoritative view of what happened in the previous fiscal year. And Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you or your team may have.
Thank you very much. I am now going to open the floor for questions. Hearing none. I would like to thank Executive Superintendent Hobbs for your presentation. That was very clear, very authoritative, and we are in good shape.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We're now going to move to 1203. Again, I'm going to turn this over to you, Mr. Hobbs. It's the board credit and lease facility resolutions, which we do as a formality, an important one, albeit, every year. So I'm going to move to motion number 1. And I'm going to ask if Superintendent or Trustee McDonald and Trustee Parisier would move that the Upper Canada District School Board authorizes administration to borrow funds as stipulated in Board Policy 325, cash management, and consistent with the board's banking contract for cash flow purposes and to support the operating needs of the board in the amount of $25 million for the 2021-22 fiscal year.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to remind you that I have declared a conflict on this one, so I shouldn't be moving or seconding any motions.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Chair, John McCrae will move that.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's moved by, I forget who's my seconder.
Trustee Parisier.
Trustee Parisier. So you have the motion before you. Are there any questions? If not, please cast your ballot. I'm in favor.
Thank you, Chair. Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. We're moving to motion number 2, and it will be moved by Trustee Schooler, seconded by Trustee Swan, that the Upper Canada District School Board authorize a lease facility with its bank, RBC Royal Bank, in the amount of $3 million for the short-term borrowing needs related to capital expenditures and acquisition of equipment through fixed-term lease for the 2021-22 fiscal year. Any questions? Hearing none, please cast your ballot. I'm in favor.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. Motion number 3 is moved by Trustee Danaher, seconded by Trustee Cram, that the Upper Canada District School Board authorize a credit facility with its bank, RBC Royal Bank, in the amount of $20 million for short-term borrowing needs related to capital projects until such time as the Ministry of Education funding is received for the 2021-22 fiscal year. Any questions? Hearing none, please cast your ballots. All in favor?
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. Motion number 4 is moved by Vice Chair McPherson, seconded by Trustee Swan, that the Upper Canada District School Board authorize a credit facility with its bank, RBC Royal Bank, in the amount of $2 million by way of letters of credit and letters of guarantee for the 2021-2022 fiscal year. Please cast your ballots.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you very much. I believe that concludes our business as such. We are now moving into private session, and I have a motion moved by Trustee Barry, seconded by Trustee Cram, that the Upper Canada District School Board move into Committee of the Whole June 16th, 2021 at 8:10. Please cast your ballots.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
I believe there's a second motion. It's moved by Trustee Schooler, seconded by Trustee McDonald, that Committee of the Whole move into private session June 16, 2021. Please cast your ballots.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. I guess we are now in private session. Am I correct, Acting Secretary?